He was a faculty position at the University of Tennessee. He rose to associate professor of surgery with tenure at that job. After 12 years there in Memphis, he then moved on for another opportunity and future challenges in Colorado, where he took the position as in Colorado Springs, and has helped to navigate them from level 2 to level 1 status under his leadership. He is the state chair of the Colorado Committee on Trauma, and he served on a variety of regional committees. He's a faithful attender of the Southwestern Surgical Congress and contributor, and has been very helpful in our multi-center trials group as well. It's really a true privilege to introduce to you the Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lectureship, Dr. Tom Schroeppel.
All right. Good. On. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Katari. It is a pleasure to be here speaking to this audience and a privilege to be the Poth Memorial Lecture deliverer. Just to get to know my audience a little bit, how many people in the room consider themselves general surgeons? Oh, good. That makes it so much easier. How about subspecialists? So there's a lot of crossover, a lot of both. How many trainees do we have in the room? Okay, good. And then how many advanced practice providers? Okay. How many of you have ever been called just a general surgeon? Oh, good. That makes this even easier. So let's make sure I do this correctly. To get started, I have no disclosures. Dr. Poth was born in Seguin, Texas, and lived from 1899 to 1989. He did his undergraduate training at the University of Texas in Austin, followed by a doctorate at the University of California Medical School at Hopkins, and then did his general surgery residency in Stanford, and then spent 4 years in Galveston and rose to the Ashbel Smith Professor of Surgery. And I think what sums up Dr. Poth best, and what I am certainly striving for, is one of his trainees and colleagues, James Thompson, called him a tough, demanding, incisive, unrelenting disciplinarian who is the smartest man in any room. And I think that's telling. There are lots of influential and renowned surgeons on this list, and it's a pleasure to be added to this list. I want to emphasize one particular lecture, and that's by Dr. Harkin in 2010, because as I prepared for this, I reviewed many of the published Poth lectures, and that one really struck a keynote for me. So I will be returning to that lecture many times during the next 30 minutes or so. So Dr. Katari, as he mentioned, and I go way back. And interestingly, just this afternoon, as I was polishing up my lecture, and as I was doing this, I actually pulled out my case log, which you'll get to see at some point from residency, and then one of my evaluations. And I had let my wife read it, and it's very interesting because one of the criticisms was Dr. Schroeppel does not enjoy administrative tasks and is not good at this. He could improve, which Dr. Katari contributed to, and I finished this lecture about 45 minutes ago, so some things just don't change. And he really, really loves to be a photo bandit. And as Dr. Murayama said, if you'll notice, he is in the right-hand side of the picture as Mr. Selfie Stick. So this is in Nashville at Southeastern Surgical, where he was the visiting guest as the president of the Southwestern. This is last year at Southwestern in Maui. Lots of pictures. Again, there's some where he doesn't have that right side, but many of them do. 2019, unfortunately, we didn't have a meeting in person in 2020, but in 2019, that was we were in Huntington Beach, and you'll notice a theme again, he's in the right side of the photo. And then he's a bandit. He will pick photos from random places, and you have no idea you're being stalked by a trained hunter. Shonal Katari. 2018, there's the pensive Katari in the back, and I have no idea who took that picture, but they managed to get both of us. It was Dr. Stewart. There we go. Dr. Stewart is not so subtle when he takes his photos. And finally, 2 days before I arrived here, I happened to get this picture with my former boss, Martin Kroos, who I had no idea was giving the guest lecture at Dr. Katari's shop in Greenville. Again, picture from the right side and Dr. Guattari holding the camera. So just a general surgeon, and this topic struck home for me and struck home for many others. As Dr. Guattari and I had accepted the lectureship, but hadn't chosen a topic. So he called me and he said, "Hey, what are you going to do?" And we started talking about things, and he goes, "You know, I was walking with a student the other day, and the student commented, 'So you're just a general surgeon.'" And I'm like, "Yeah, man, I hate that. I just don't think they understand what that means. Just a general surgeon." And as we discussed earlier, many of you in this room put your hands up with just a general surgeon. So what is a general surgeon? And I'm going to try to lay out my thoughts on this, provide some evidence, and as we finish the lecture, we'll see if I've enlightened anyone in this room. So Dr. Guattari also played a role in this case. I was fortunate enough to be on call on July 1st, 2006, so my first independent call. And I think the discussion on the bariatrics case and whether you're ready for something will outline this. So I want you all to take a peek at this and let me know if on day one of your independent practice, you'd be ready for this sort of a scenario. So first independent call shift, transfer from a suburban hospital in Memphis. I happened to be the only person in the hospital on call. And the chief complaint was the patient has a vascular problem with the intestine. Came in overtly septic, multiple pressors, peritonitis, altered, took him in the operating room, and that's what I found. My first case as an attending on independent call. So all of the small bowel was dead with the exception of maybe 5 centimeters just past the ligament, about half of the colon. And the surgical principles with this really aren't that hard, right? You take out the dead stuff. The problem is there's not enough to live on if you take out the dead stuff. So after multiple frantic phone calls to Tim Fabian and Martin Kroos and Shonal Guattari and others that were my partners, I'm like, what the heck do I do with this? And they're like, there's not much of a decision. You close, you do palliative, and you proceed with comfort care, which as your first case on call, as an independent physician, that's an interesting decision tree. So how many of the trainees in this room or the young attendings would be ready for this as an independent practitioner on day one? A couple, good. I wasn't. I'll tell you that. I needed a bunch of phone calls by senior partners and people I trust to let me know that I was doing the right thing, because when life and death is in your hands, that changes a little bit. It also changes, as most of you know in this room, when your name's on the chart and you're not just a trainee on the other side of the table, it makes a big difference. So the objectives of this lecture. I want to define general surgery. I want to define the origins of what our current training paradigm is. I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Harkin's lecture where he talked about the megafauna of surgery. I really enjoyed that. And I want to talk about a little bit about current factors in training that determine our current scope. As many of you in the room identified as general surgeons, this should ring true. And I'll see if I can convince you whether that's the same as it was when you trained or whether it's different now. I'm going to talk a little bit about duty hours. Don't groan. I think it does play a role. Talk about operative components of our training. Talk about the confidence of the graduating residents, because I saw there were many of you in this room that were trainees that did not put your hands up for that first case. And similar to your presentation, I mean, as a day one, I don't know if I would want to do a transgastric ERCP. I don't know the answer to that. And then we'll talk a little bit about future directions. So, consistent with what many of our patients do, I went to Dr. Google when I was starting to prepare this lecture to see what the definition of a general surgeon was. And nothing came up under general surgeon. I had to go to surgeon. And Merriam-Webster came up. That was hit number 1, medical specialist who practices surgery. Okay. Tabor came up as number 2. It's very similar definition. And then we got to the Board of Surgery, which was a little bit more in depth. Knowledge and responsibility for the preoperative, operative, postoperative management of patients, broad spectrum of diseases, non-operative, elective, emergency, and the breadth and depth of this knowledge may vary by disease category, which is very interesting to put on their website. Surgical management requires skill and complex decision-making, and general surgeons should be competent, not they are competent, they should be competent in diagnosis as well as treatment and management. And then they go a little bit further. So what are we actually talking about? Well, conditions affecting the alimentary tract, the abdomen and its contents, breast, skin, and soft tissue, endocrine, critical care, oncology, and trauma. And to add to that, and I don't know if you all knew what you signed up for when you came in, but there's more. Terminally ill patients to include palliative and pain, nutrition, cachexia in patients with malignant and chronic conditions, counseling, and support for end-of-life decisions. In addition, morbid obesity, which I know many of you are dealing with morbid obesity, geriatric surgical patients, which is a lion's share of my trauma patients that I admit in Colorado Springs, and then culturally diverse and vulnerable populations. Hit number 5 was American College of Surgeons, and they get a little bit more into the technical component of the training program. So 5 years, no more than 12 months devoted to a single surgical discipline, not more than 6 months in non-clinical surgical disciplines, and at least 54 months must be in clinical surgery with experience in endoscopy, surgical intensive care, and emergency care. And finally, 3 of the clinical years must be concerned with the principal components of general surgery. So that's kind of what I remembered as a definition. So Dr. Chris Kabara shared this slide with me, and it really is the sum of everything we do. And what I really like is that my favorites, trauma and surgical critical care, are at the head of the animal and everything else is behind. So those are the more cerebral specialties as I interpret it. So there are American Board of Medical Specialties kind of runs all the boards. And the primary boards are general surgery, which came about in 1937, and vascular surgery, which was changed from a subspecialty certification to a primary board in 2006. Additionally, there's Surg-Onc, hospice and palliative medicine, pediatric surgery, surgery of the hand, and surgery critical care. And I believe that's up to date. So who started all this as we currently know it? And many of us in this room know it's Dr. Halstead, who was the first surgeon in chief at Hopkins, who came up with a graduated authority and autonomy. As you earn it, you get more and more. In a lecture he gave at Yale in 1904, he said, "We need a system, and surely we'll have it, which will produce not only surgeons, but surgeons of the highest type who will stimulate the finest youth of the country to study surgery and devote their energies and their lives to raising standards of surgical science." And I think many of us hold that true today. So what about this surgical megafauna? What does that mean? And how many of you were at the 2010 Poth lecture? A couple. I hope it was well received because I was enthralled as I was reading, and it was very interesting. So this is Dr. Harkin. Surgeons are now and always be large, iconic, charismatic, and culturally important megafauna. This still is true as well. American medicine and surgery have developed into an eclectic slurry of minor subspecialties, and that seems to probably only have gotten worse since 2010. And finally, and this is probably why I really liked it, he called out trauma surgeons and acute care surgeons who have been culturally programmed to be expansive and collaborative in their acceptance of whatever arrives in the ED, joined with uniquely capable general surgery to create acute care surgery. And as it blossoms to fill a very real societal need, is it easy to envision the very bright future of general surgery. This charge in the transformation of general surgery is predictably being led by surgical megafauna. So I'm going to try to make the case that as many of you in this room do trauma, and almost everybody in this room raise their hand as general surgeons, I also do trauma, but I am still a general surgeon. So what about the current factors in training, and where does this just a general surgeon come from? So I think part of it is the duty hours. Part of it is the operative components in what we teach our residents. And then part of it is the EMR, which is a surrogate for all the documentation that all of us are currently doing. And I found an interesting study out of the Carolinas Medical Center that was recently published that I will share with you that lets you know how much time a general surgery resident actually spends on the EMR. So what about the duty hours? Well, Libby Zion case was, believe it or not, 38 years ago in New York. 38 years ago. Libby Zion was the daughter of a prominent journalist who actually worked for the New York Times, was admitted to the hospital and was altered, febrile, and confused. They gave her restraints, sedatives, and narcotics, and she died 6 to 8 hours later. Probably from serotonin syndrome, but I think that's still a matter of debate. But that led to a grand jury commissioning the Bell Commission to look into that, and they decided that it was related to fatigue. So they came up with some suggestions about what we should do, which include 80 hours per week over a 4-week period, and a lot of this should seem familiar to you, and should not be scheduled to work as a matter of course more than 24 consecutive hours with 1 day off per work week. And then the New York State Health Department incorporated that into its hospital code in 1989. So the ACGME took this up, and 14 years later, we had the 2003 work hour rules, which is a very significant interest for me because I lived through this. This is when I was a resident. So I remember pre and post in real time because the 2003 had a profound effect on me because at the time in lacrosse, we did home call. So we took a very strict interpretation of it, and the home call counted. So if I was technically on call, even though no cases came in overnight, they forced me to go home the next day, which certainly affected my training because I missed out on cases, even if I was well rested. And I remember it vividly, as you can tell. So very similar. Residents are limited to a maximum 80 hours of duty per week, 1 day and 7 free, and they cannot be scheduled for in-house call more than 1 in every 3. Duty periods cannot last for more than 24 hours, and then at least 10 hours for rest and personal activities between daily duty periods, and no moonlighting. This was amended in 2011 to pretty much look only at interns, limited to 16 hours instead of the 24 shift. They may not moonlight. Strategic napping, which I always love because I love my strategic naps even now, but I certainly didn't have time to do it in residency. And then 4 hours allowed for transition of care after 24 instead of the 6 that had been present in 2003, and no more than 6 consecutive nights of night float. Home call was now included, even though in lacrosse in the early years it was included then. And then after the first trial came out, the 2017 revisions kind of dropped that back to the previous rules, and strategic napping was removed. So what did this do? I mean, what did this really do? So there was a study that came out just this past year in the Journal of Surgical Education where they did a systematic review of 15 articles examining the 2011 work hours. They looked at outcomes and found that there were no major differences in outcomes, albeit there might have been a slightly decreased efficiency in care. And I published 2 of those studies, so I will talk about that in just a minute. And then case volumes. Now, when the work hours came out, many of us thought that case volumes would go down because we were restricting access to the OR. There was mixed data about it, but most papers, and I'll make this argument a little bit, actually showed that the case volume went up. And then there were decrease in major cases and exposure to complex cases. And I think that's 100% true for a variety of reasons. Quality of life, which was one of the reasons to actually implement the work hours. There was mixed results of studies again. Some showed a better sense of well-being. However, there was less professional satisfaction. The shift of duties from PJ1 to higher level residents makes sense because they weren't in the hospital as much. Pretty much nobody was working 16, so that made you shift to shift work, 12-hour shifts. The overall findings of the review, no significant association of patient outcomes or quality of life measures, and a decreased participation in surgical and educational endeavors of the junior residents, which is interesting because they actually were implemented to increase their participation in educational endeavors. I see some residents nodding, so I think some of this is ringing true. So what's out there? These are 2 papers that I published. I presented this at Southeastern Surgical Congress, which I'm still a member, the sister organization, in 2014. The aim was to look at the 2003 duty hours and outcomes. And I was in Memphis at the time. And what we did was looked at a expansive period of about 13 years. We excluded the patients immediately pre and post because that was sort of a run-in period. And we had just under 42,000 patients. We saw a lot of people in Memphis, roughly split between pre and post. And I didn't list the basic demographics because with 42,000 patients, absolutely everything was significantly different, although there were few clinically significant differences between the populations. And what we saw pre and post to work hours is the length of stay, the intensive care unit length of stay, and the mortality were all higher in the post period. When we did adjusted logistic regression, we found that the post period was no longer predictive of mortality, which good, we weren't actually affecting those outcomes. And that was after adjusting for shock state, brain injury, and injury severity score. And then when we looked at length of stay, the post period added about a day for those patients, and very significant, even after adjusting for injury severity score, transfusions, and spinal cord injury. So the efficiency of care was definitely less. More handoffs, more turnovers, poorer communication. I repeated this study the following year and presented at the Southeastern Surgical Congress, but now looked at the 2011 duty hours. And what we found through that 4-year time period is we had just over 9,000 patients equally split between pre and post. There were no differences in the basic demographics, so I haven't displayed that table. And what you can see is very similar findings to the first study, where actually the length of stay was longer, the ICU length of stay longer, more vent days, but no difference in mortality. And when we did an adjusted analysis after adjusting for shock state, age, and brain injury, the post period was not predictive of mortality, so we weren't harming patients, but we were less efficient than even 2003 because the post period consistently added time to your hospital stay after adjusting for injury severity, transfusions, and spinal cord injury. So we are less efficient than even 2003. So what do residents think about this? And I would love to have a cocktail later on and see what your thoughts really are, but this is one of the studies. So this was a 2010 ABSITE survey. So for those of you that were residents in that time period, you took this. And it was just over 6,000 residents. Response rate was greater than 90%. So obviously some people left some things blank. What we found was junior residents favored working fewer hours. Factors that contributed to medical errors were mostly system issues, not necessarily related to time in the hospital or fatigue. And duty hour limits do not improve the quality of care. And that's what the residents thought in 2010. So speaking of photo sniper, randomly in July of 2019, I get this picture. And it says, hey, I didn't notice you were a server and pouring wine. So I think what he was relating to is my doximity photo from 2009, when I happened to have long hair and Martin Kroos about strung me up and said I needed to have different hair. In any case, I didn't cut it. But no, that was not me in the restaurant. So this is another case, and I will open this up to the audience for thoughts on what this was. I was actually operating a local chef in Memphis who had a small bowel obstruction. It looked to be complete, so I took him to the operating room and foreign body lodge near the ileocecal valve, and that's what I took out. Anybody have any idea what that is? Any guesses? This is a bivalved jalapeno pepper from a chef that actually worked at the Peabody. She had forgotten her dentures and was really hungry and put the thing down whole. She admitted to it after I actually took it out. She goes, yeah, I did that. And I'm sure many of you have these cases. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the operative components. And that's obviously when I still had short hair, and it's actually a picture from lacrosse that Qatari probably took. We'll talk a little bit about operative volume. What sort of cases are out there right now? And then what's the confidence level? So these are actually my case logs. As I told you, I pulled them when I was reviewing for this lecture, and I was a little surprising. I didn't realize I did that many cases, but just short of 1,550 cases in my time in lacrosse, just short of 350 as the surgeon chief, and about 60 as a teaching assist. And then I think one of the things and one of the themes that many of you will see, and former Poth lecturers have commented on, include Dr. Moore and Dr. Feliciano, is the vascular experience and exposure of residents to those cases is much different than it was when many of us in this room have trained. So I had about 10% of my case volume was vascular cases, including 19 aortas, 35 carotids, and 44 peripheral vascular. And that's probably why I'm very comfortable with it. So what's out there? And this is a study that was recently in surgery, a 20-year review of the ACGME case logs. The study period was 99 through 2019. Case number increased by 10%. Majority of these cases were at the surgeon junior level, which is very interesting. And the breadth and variety of cases are decreasing. So this is a chart, shows you just that difference over time. And what you can see is the overall cases in the gray bars go up. The top bar is the junior cases, and that's definitely a trend up, but the chief year bar is level. And if you look at this, the lighter gray bar here shows the types of cases that actually residents are doing. And GI tract, abdomen are increased. Vascular is about half. There are some other differences there, but I think that those are the most important. So another study came out of the Journal of Surgical Education 2020, which looked at these same case logs, but dug into it a little bit more, and the time period is slightly different. This is 2009 to 2018. And case volume is up during this time interval. So our fears about case volumes going down really haven't held true. So case volumes are up over this time interval, most at the surgeon junior level, and no change at the surgeon chief level. And the core cases, as defined by the core score curriculum, are the ones that went up. So some of the basic cases and the advanced cases decreased. This is a chart showing that over time. And as you can see, those hollow triangles are the advanced level cases, and you can see the core cases are going up. So we're doing more of the straightforward things and less of the complicated things. And this is the same chart, but looking at it at surgeon chief and surgeon junior. And the advanced cases in both groups are going down, and the core cases, even though it looks like it's going up in surgeon chief, it wasn't statistically different. And it was so in the surgeon junior. So we're getting more operating early on, but it's not of the advanced cases or of the complicated cases. So this is another study which just looked at a single center over 19 years. This was in the Journal of Surgical Research in 2018. And 106 residents over that time period had graduated. And the other thing that's really important is a decreased volume of teaching assist cases. And as I think everyone in the room knows, it's one thing to be standing across from attending and doing an operation, and quite another to be standing across from a junior resident and getting them through an operation. That's when you know that you know how to do the operation. And that has gone down over time. Also had a decrease in volume of vascular, hepatic, and endocrine cases. So the advanced cases that we discussed previously. So what about confidence? And this was a survey of PGY 5 residents that was sent out to program directors, 249 programs, a 59% response rate, which I thought was pretty remarkable for a survey. 19% with greater than 300 cases in the chief year. Now, as a comparison, I did 346. That's not bragging, that's just the numbers. 89% with greater than 750, which is what the board defines for you to actually sit for your boards. So that's a little bit scary that 11% of graduating residents don't have enough cases to sit for their boards. 95% were confident with basic laparoscopy. 75% confident with open surgical cases, which means a quarter of the residents were not confident opening an abdomen. 57% confident with advanced laparoscopy. And this part is really telling. 72% confident that they are prepared for independent practice. You know, and this is probably why 70 to 80% of our graduates are going on to fellowships. It's more time to get reps in, it's more time to do the things that they probably want to do. I did the same thing. I wasn't not confident, I just wanted to operate more. So what about the EMR? And I found this really interesting. And again, this is not a war against any of the EMR companies. This just lets you know, this particular study, how much time all of us spend at the computer, because it's not just the residents. This is a surrogate for all of us. So this is, as I mentioned, from Carolinas Medical Center, published in 2020, and I think some of you in the room are from there, so you may be on this paper. The study period was 2014 to 2019. Total time in the EMR, 2,512 hours. 10.6 work weeks. 10.4 work weeks documentation versus chart review. 5.4 work weeks on order entry. 7.9 months during your surgical training on the electronic medical record. And we all feel that. This is not different for the attendings. Well, it might be. I have to do a lot of documentation at my shop, so maybe you do a slightly less, but that's a lot of time. So I think you know, change probably needs to come in what we document, and it needs to come from the billing companies, because anybody that's read an electronic medical record knows that 98% of that note is for billing, and very little clinical information is now included in that. So in summary, duty hours, operative factors, and resident perceptions. I think all of these things play a role for decreased recognition of the general surgeon. And that leads to our current state, which gives me a headache. And I think it gives many of you a headache as well. So I think general surgery training, and I'm really, really proud that many of you in this room still identify as a general surgeon, myself included. It gives us a basis for sound technical skills. Good training is sound technical skills. Gives us a basis for good decisions in and out of the operating room. It's the foundation for many of our subspecialties, because many of you who raised your hand as a subspecialist, myself included, our foundation is in general surgery. And I think we should remain the rescue service in clinical care. And for those of you that were at LD Brick's Scudder oration, when he talked about the fourth arm of acute care surgery as surgical rescue, I think that's really important. And many general surgery services are that for the hospital. If somebody's really sick, who do they call? They usually call the surgery service. So, does general surgery still exist? I think it does. And I think it especially exists in acute care surgery, pediatric surgery, and especially in rural general surgery. Because the way I was trained, I certainly do not practice now, doing hysterectomies, C-sections. Gunderson was a community-based program, so we learned how to do all those things like general surgeons do out in the frontier and the rural areas. I think acute care surgery is another bastion of general surgery. And as Dr. Harkin mentioned in his 2010 lecture, I think we still continue to have a lot of those qualities that general surgery did years ago. The new fellowship was started, at least the idea for which many of you in this room may have been involved in 2003 through the American College of Surgeons and our trauma organizations. In 2005, AAST renamed its committee the Acute Care Surgery Committee. 2007, the curriculum, competency tools, case registry, and certification sites visits were developed. 2008 was the first accredited AAST acute care surgery program. Currently, there are 28 programs that are fully accredited, and they really look to get more cases in all of these areas where we're deficient currently. It looks to augment those advanced cases that a lot of the residents just aren't getting anymore. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Many disease states are now non-operative. We have more subspecialists. I mean, there are numerous reasons. So what about the surgical megafauna? I think Dr. Harkin had modified this quote from Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, and I think it still holds true. It is a far, far better thing that I do, excuse me, general surgery than I've ever done, and a far, far better place I go, acute care surgery, than I've ever known. So, are you just a general surgeon? I would say no. And this is for Dr. Katari, because he sent me all these things over the years, because as I am poor with my administrative tasks, the free beer is always tomorrow. But you know what, Dr. Katari? Tonight it's on me. Thank you very much.
Am I allowed to share the story behind that free beer tomorrow or not?
Of course.
You would never know it by the amazing academic accomplishments that Dr. Schroeppel has had in his career, but there's only one resident that I've ever kicked out of my OR for a month, and that was Dr. Schroeppel. And but it was only for one day. It's because I was waiting for his first paper to finally a draft of it. And I knew he was kept putting this off, hence his lack of desire for some of these administrative tasks. And he came to the OR. I knew I had him when he was come back in my rotation, because you can't operate until I get the manuscript. So he'd come to the OR every day, and the fellow's stealing the case. He's doing all this great stuff. And he'd walk in and he'd say, I'll have it to you tomorrow. I said, okay. And the next day I'd be in the OR, and then we'd be doing some more cases. And then he'd walk in, he's like, I'm going to have it to you tomorrow. And this just kept going on and on. And then I told him, I said, have you ever been to New Orleans? He's like, what? And I said, there's a bar on Bourbon Street, and there's a sign in it that says free beer tomorrow. So every time you show up, you're like, oh no, it's free beer tomorrow. So, so this went on and on until eventually he did get the manuscript. We did eventually publish it. And at his graduation, he shared that story and did in fact give me a 6-pack and say, Dr. Tari, here's your free beer. So the tough love who would have known, incredibly productive academic career that he has then gone on to do. But the reason I want you to stay here is because we have been talking a lot during this meeting that we have record number of industry support, which is true, but in no small part because your institution, UC Health, was our only gold sponsor. And they did this in honor of you. And I have some words here that I'd like to share on their behalf about you. At UC Health, our mission is to improve lives, and Dr. Thomas Schroeppel lives up to that mission daily. We are grateful to have a strong trauma medical director and surgeon who consistently leads with a balance of structure, respect, accountability, and the pursuit of system process improvement. In 2018, he led UC Health Memorial Central from a level 2 trauma center to a level 1 with 0 deficiencies. And remarkably, this was his first position as a trauma medical director. In this role, he takes his responsibility seriously to ensure all injured and emergency surgical patients meet the quality standards set forth by accrediting organizations. But more importantly, that our teams meet the high standards that he would expect his own family member to receive as a patient. UC Health Memorial Central has a successful trauma program because of him. We're also very thankful for his lovely wife, Paige, who is as special in her role as a critical care pharmacist and leader at UC Health. UC Health is happy to honor the great work that Dr. Schroeppel has accomplished throughout his career, especially over the last 6 years in Southern Colorado. Please help us recognize and thank Dr. Thomas Schroeppel as the 2022 Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecturer.